Stand tall. JustProfessor here. Once you know something, you can't remember what it was like not to know it, and this makes you absolutely terrible at explaining things to people who don't know them yet. Your expertise is actually making you worse at communication, and you don't even realize it's happening. Think about the last time an expert tried to explain something to you and you had no idea what they were talking about. They used jargon you didn't understand. They skipped steps that seemed obvious to them but weren't obvious to you. They explained things in a way that made perfect sense to someone who already knew the topic but was completely confusing to a beginner. That expert wasn't trying to be unhelpful. They were suffering from the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something deeply, you lose the ability to imagine what it's like not to understand it. And this curse affects way more than just teaching. The curse of knowledge is when knowing something makes it nearly impossible to think about problems from the perspective of someone who doesn't know that thing. Once information is in your brain, you can't unknow it. You can't put yourself back in the mental state of ignorance. And this makes you terrible at communicating with people who are still in that state of not knowing. This happens because when you learn something, it becomes obvious to you. The connections seem clear. The logic seems straightforward. You forget that these things weren't always obvious. You forget the struggle of learning it. You forget what confused you. Your brain reorganizes information once you understand it, and you lose access to what it felt like before that reorganization happened. The problem is this affects teaching, writing instructions, giving directions, explaining your work, and basically any situation where you need to help someone understand something you already know. You skip steps because they seem obvious. You use terms without defining them because you forgot people might not know those terms. You explain things in an order that makes sense to experts but confuses beginners. And you have no idea you're doing this because from your perspective, you're being clear. Let me show you where the curse of knowledge destroys communication. Teaching is the most obvious place. Teachers who are deep experts in their subject often make the worst teachers for beginners. They've been thinking about the subject for so long that basic concepts seem trivially simple. They can't remember struggling with fundamentals. So they rush through basics and jump to advanced concepts, leaving students completely lost. Meanwhile, someone who just learned the material last year might be a better teacher for complete beginners because they still remember what was confusing. They still have access to the perspective of not knowing. But, as they get more expert, they'll lose that access and become worse at teaching beginners even though they know more. Technical writing is destroyed by the curse of knowledge. Engineers write user manuals that make perfect sense to other engineers but are incomprehensible to regular users. They use technical terms without explanation. Because those terms are so familiar, they forgot they needed explanation. They skip steps that are obvious to someone with technical background, but not obvious to someone without it. The manual seems clear to the writer because the writer already knows how everything works. Customer service has this problem constantly. Someone calls with a basic question about a product. The support person has answered this question 1,000 times, and it seems incredibly simple to them. So they rush through the answer using shortcuts and assumptions, leaving the customer confused. The support person thinks they explained clearly. The customer is more confused than before they called. The curse of knowledge created a communication gap neither person understands is happening. Directions and instructions suffer massively. You're giving someone directions to your house. You've driven the route hundreds of times. Certain landmarks are obvious to you. Certain turns are familiar. So you say, "Turn left at the big tree," without realizing there are 5 big trees. And you have no idea which one seems biggest to someone who's never been there before. Or you say, "It's right after the gas station," forgetting there are 3 gas stations along that route. The directions make perfect sense to you because you know the area. They're useless to someone who doesn't. Software development is full of curse of knowledge problems. Developers build interfaces that make perfect sense to people who understand how the software works internally. But regular users don't have that internal knowledge. So the interface is confusing and unintuitive even though the developer thinks it's obvious. The developer can't see the interface through a beginner's eyes because they know too much. Relationships get hurt by this in subtle ways. You've been thinking about some problem for days. It's obvious to you what the issue is and what needs to happen. So you try to explain it to your partner in one sentence, assuming they have all the context you've built up in your head over those days of thinking. They don't. They're confused. You get frustrated that they don't understand something that seems so clear to you. The curse of knowledge made you forget they don't have the same mental context you do. Business communication fails because of this constantly. A manager thinks about strategy all day, every day. When they explain a new initiative to their team, they skip all the reasoning and context that led to the decision because that reasoning is so familiar to them. They jump straight to the conclusion. The team is confused about why they're doing this new thing because they don't have the context. The manager thinks they communicated clearly because in their head, the logic is obvious. Parents experience this with their kids. Once you've been an adult for decades, you forget what it was like to be a child without adult knowledge. You expect kids to understand things that aren't actually obvious unless you have years of life experience. You get frustrated when they don't get something that seems simple to you, forgetting you also didn't get it when you were their age. Experts giving advice fall into this trap. Someone who's been successful in business gives advice to someone starting out. The expert has internalized so many skills and knowledge over the years that they don't even realize they're using them. So their advice skips all those unspoken foundations. They say, just do X, when actually doing X requires knowing Y and Z first, but those are so obvious to the expert they don't even think to mention them. So how do you fight the curse of knowledge? How do you communicate clearly with people who don't know what you know? First, actively try to remember being confused. Before you explain something, spend time really trying to recall what it was like before you understood it. What confused you? What questions did you have? What seemed hard? This is difficult because the curse of knowledge fights against this recall, but trying anyway helps you identify where beginners might struggle. Second, test your explanations on people who don't know the topic. If you're writing instructions, have someone unfamiliar try to follow them. If you're teaching something, check in constantly to see if people are following. Don't assume clarity. Verify it. Beginners will reveal all the gaps in your explanation that the curse of knowledge made invisible to you. Third, define your terms. When you use specialized vocabulary or jargon, stop and explain it even if it feels unnecessary. The curse of knowledge makes expert terms feel like common knowledge when they're not. Assume people don't know what you mean and spell it out. Fourth, show your work and explain your reasoning. Don't just jump to conclusions that are obvious to you. Walk through the steps that got you there. Explain why each step follows from the previous one. Make the implicit explicit even when it feels tedious. Fifth, get feedback and actually listen to it. When someone says they're confused by your explanation, don't just repeat the same explanation. That's the curse of knowledge in action. You think you were clear, so you say the same thing again. Instead, recognize that your explanation has gaps you can't see, and try a completely different approach. Sixth, use analogies to familiar concepts. If you're explaining something new, connect it to things your audience already knows. This bridges the knowledge gap without requiring them to already understand your expert perspective. Seventh, be patient. The curse of knowledge makes teaching frustrating because things that are obvious to you are not obvious to learners. Recognize this frustration as a sign the curse is active. The student isn't being slow. You've just forgotten what it's like not to know this. The curse of knowledge is making you a worse communicator than you realize. Every time you gain expertise in something, you lose the ability to see that thing from a beginner's perspective. You forget what was confusing. You forget what needed explanation. You forget which steps aren't actually obvious. And because this forgetting happens automatically, you have no idea your explanations are unclear. This affects teachers, technical writers, managers, support staff, parents, experts, and anyone who tries to help others understand something they know well. The more you know, the worse you get at explaining to people who don't know. It's a cruel irony. Expertise makes you worse at sharing that expertise. Understanding the curse of knowledge doesn't make it go away. You still can't fully access the mindset of not knowing something you know. But awareness helps. It makes you more cautious about assuming clarity. It makes you more likely to explain things that feel obvious. It makes you test your communication instead of assuming it worked. The next time you try to explain something and the other person seems confused, don't assume they're slow or not paying attention. Assume the curse of knowledge is making you skip steps and use terms that aren't as clear as they seem to you. Try a different explanation. Ask what specifically is confusing. Fill in gaps you didn't realize existed. Your knowledge is valuable, but only if you can share it effectively. And sharing it effectively requires fighting against your brain's natural tendency to forget what it's like not to know. That's the curse, and it's on you to break it. Subscribe to learn about more biases making you worse at communication and learning.